right, everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I am your host, Philip Drew, Administrator, and joining me now on the phone is Clyde Cleveland. They call him the Green Libertarian. He's an entrepreneur and a former Libertarian candidate for governor of Iowa. He's the co-author with Edward Noyes of Restoring the Heart of America, A Return to Government by the People, which is an awesome book describing what America would be like if it was a free society. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Why do they call you the Green Libertarian?
Well, I have a strong background as what I call an entrepreneurial environmentalist. Many of the companies that I've been involved with over the years have been companies that have done something or in some way been very, very positive to restore the environment, or created some new invention that would be good for the environment, or something in renewable resources or something like that. So because of that experience, in 1986, I was named at an international convention on socially conscious investing, the first socially conscious venture capitalist. And so it just kind of made sense to a lot of people because of the green background, what they consider a green background, and my very much strong libertarian leanings and belief in individual freedom. The name Green Libertarian, or that label, is kind of stuck.
Oh, well, that's certainly no shame. Maybe for some of our more left-wing listeners, you could explain where you differ from the Green Party. I notice in your book you go through their platform and pretty much agree with almost all of it.
Well, actually, I have to tell you, and this means no disrespect to the Greens at all, but I really believe that I am resonating with the 10 core green values more than most Greens I've met. I know some Greens that are very, very much in tune with the core values, but if you really understand, I believe, the green core values, it's all about returning to more of a bottom-up society and having more local control. And, that's exactly what I believe, we need to move, the direction we need to move, where we, instead of being controlled from the top down, we go back and return to the fundamental principles our country was based on. And that doesn't mean going back in terms of technology or science or modern developments or anything like that. That means going back in terms of our understanding of power to a bottom-up society where most of the power is with the individual and the family and the local community, and it runs upward. In other words, if we want something to be done by the state or federal government, it's because we decide at the local level to give that power to the state, and we can take it back at any time. I guess the best way to explain it is really, and I've been thinking a lot about this, so I'm really excited you called today and wanted to do the interview, because I really realized that the book I think it takes a really good step towards explaining bottom-up government and this fundamental concept of liberty and individual power and local the power of the family and the local community. But really what it's all about, and this is what the founders understood, that no one else has ever created a government, in my belief, before or after, really understood to the level they did, is the difference between indigenous power and surrogate power. Indigenous power is the power that we are born with as natural-born human beings, created human beings. The founders called it we are born with unalienable rights. In other words, rights that can't be taken away from us. These are our rights that we're born with. We can give them away, but they can't be taken away from us because we are born with them. If we choose to give them away, that's one thing. But we can't. We actually are born with these rights. This is indigenous power.
And we can only give away ours, not our neighbors.
That's right. That's right. And we're born with it. Now, surrogate power is the power that we all give to institutions. Whether we get married, the institution of marriage, the marriage itself now has some power. That's an institution that now we give some power to the family. We give power to a partnership. If we enter into a business partnership with two people, that partnership now has certain obligations, it has duties, it has rights, and we're giving some of our indigenous power to that partnership. If we decide to be involved with a religion, we give some of our power to the religion. If we decide to get involved in local government, create a local government to do certain things for for us, like to pick up our garbage and to give up our streets, and we agree to give up some of our money to get those things done, we're giving up some of our power to that government. So we create these institutions all the time that take some of our power because we've given it to them. The problem comes when those institutions don't realize that we are the ones that have the indigenous power and that they are surrogate. They have surrogate power. The problem is when the people involved in the institutions that really have surrogate power begin to act as if they have the indigenous power. And that is the problem that we have today. People in our government, if you hear them, what they say, the people that run our government these days, they think that the government is the sovereign. And that is the source of all of our problems.
All the way down the line, that's the source.
All the way down the line. That is really, when you really get down to it, the problem is that nobody today really understands, very few people really understand the difference between surrogate power and indigenous power. And when we all decide that we are going to when we all begin to understand that and then decide to act on it, it'll be exactly the same thing that happened when the founders of the Continental Congress in 1776 decided to declare their independence. And that document clearly explains indigenous power and surrogate power. That is the most incredible political document ever written, in my opinion, because it clearly lays out who has the indigenous power and who has the surrogate power.
Okay, well, since this is your specialty, maybe we can start with the difference then in the way people look at environmentalism from your point of view or from the more elitist top-down point of view. Right.
Well, a classic example is the Greens and the Democrats talk about at what point we want to be using more renewable resources rather than non-renewable resources, and how they are going about attaining that. And in my opinion, I want to see that shift as fast as humanly possible. The difference between how they would get there and how I would get there, and most libertarians who believe in restoring our environment, and most of them do that I know of, is completely different. And I'll give you an example. I was at a debate between the gubernatorial candidates in Des Moines a couple of years ago, and the Green and the Democrat both got up and talked about how we need to have government mandates to have a certain percentage of renewable resources by certain dates. And they were going to put all these things in place. The government was going to manage it from the top down and all this stuff. And it's complete nonsense. It's not going to work. It's force-based. And it doesn't, they're avoiding the source of the problem. They're not realizing that most of our problems in terms of not being in a renewable resource situation right now come because the government's subsidizing the non-renewable companies. The government is subsidizing the gas, oil, and coal business and industry, and has been for a long time, to the tune of, I've read different numbers and different estimates because a lot of it is hidden, anywhere from $40 billion to $80 billion a year in subsidies to those industries. So, in other words, the cost of gas, oil, and coal are much less because a lot of our tax money goes to subsidize those very industries. So if we eliminate the subsidies completely, the prices of gas, oil, and coal will naturally begin to go up, and the cost competitiveness of the renewable resources, solar, wind, energy, geothermal, hydrogen fuel cells, all these things will begin to drop because people will start using them. So really what we need is for the government to stop subsidizing rather than to mandate certain percentages of renewable usage.
Well, right, but if I was to take your argument to its extreme and say, well, there ought to be no EPA at all, no environmental regulations at all, I mean, not just asking government to encourage new good things, but even their regulations prohibiting the bad things, and wouldn't we all just live in a giant pile of sewage without all those regulations?
See, I don't think so. I really don't think so. And I'm glad you mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency because basically what the Environmental Protection Agency has become is a protection racket for the largest industries that can afford to pay to influence the Environmental Protection Agency. So, in other words, if your company is powerful enough to lobby for your chemical that is destroying the environment to be exempted from EPA protection, then it will be. But somebody else who doesn't have that power won't be. So what we've got is a very, very inefficient top-down way of managing our environment. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have any kind of government involvement at all, because I think especially at the local level we'll want some, but definitely we don't want the federal government managing our environment from the top down, because there's too many differences in different areas, and the whole political process is so corrupt that the largest polluters are always going to be able to influence the government to allow them to do the polluting that they want to do.
Okay,
that's the problem.
Well, if there weren't the executive agencies to regulate, how would the average citizen go about making sure that his drinking water is...
Let me give you an example. Well, let's talk about genetically engineered food. And at this point, let's not talk about whether it's good or bad for you. Let's just take the assumption that it's bad for you, and then we'll go back to that in a minute, okay?
Well, yeah, so it's enough to know that there are many who are concerned that it may be bad.
Right. So let's put it this way. There's a lot of people that think it's bad for you, and they want to do something about it, okay? So the people of Oregon decided that the only way that they could do something about it to protect their children and their families from genetically engineered food, because the FDA had approved it illegally. Well, we'll go back to that in a minute, but I'll just give you this one example in terms of top-down versus bottom-up. People of Oregon decided that the only way that they could protect themselves was if they knew what the heck was in the food. In other words, what they wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that the food that they were eating and that they were buying in the grocery store, if it contained genetically modified organisms, they wanted to know. They wanted to have that food labeled. Okay? So that way they could then allow the consumers to have the power to choose, and that would take care of the problem. Because a lot of people in Oregon didn't want to be eating that, didn't want to be feeding those foods to their children.
And then let me guess, the feds came and said, nope, you can't do that.
The FDA, the head of the FDA actually went to Oregon, flew to Oregon, and told the governor of Oregon that he should take this bill. It was a ballot initiative off of the ballot because it was unconstitutional, and that they were going to do everything they could to fight it. So the FDA was totally in the pockets of these huge companies who are involved with the genetically engineered foods, and they completely own and control the FDA. That's how they got it approved by the FDA, and they use the FDA as it's like an employee or a lobbyist for their industry, and doing everything they can to halt any kind of local initiative to label foods or to do anything that they can to keep those foods off their shelves in their area.
Well, and you mentioned that the FDA approved the genetically modified foods illegally.
Right. And they were sued over this. They were sued over that because they actually broke their own rules. They never did the kind of testing that was required by their own rules. The kind of long-term testing that was required of a new food like this. They claimed that it wasn't a new food, that it was exactly the same as any other kind of food. And they basically clearly broke their own rules when in 1991 or 1992 they said that genetically modified organisms and foods that had contained these organisms were just like any other kind of food and were totally safe. And at the same time, they did everything they could to keep people from labeling their food, whether it was non-genetically or genetically engineered. So, obviously, that agency is completely controlled by that particular industry, without a doubt.
Okay, well, let's go back to, I don't even think that's a point worth arguing. Of course it is. that's their job, is to sell food. And
yeah, basically.
I mean,
and but well, actually, no. Their job is supposedly to protect the citizens.
Oh,
but,
really? I'm sorry, I got confused with
but that is,
what they do and what they say.
What they do and what their actual purpose are completely different things. This is one example of the same way that most government agencies operate. They're totally controlled by special interests, by people with a lot of power. What libertarians generally believe is that if we reduce the power of the federal government, we will have a lot better chance of improving these things, because whatever we do with the people who have a lot of power are going to end up with a lot of influence over the government. So the best methodology is to make sure that that government isn't so powerful that it can do the kind of things that we were just talking about with the FDA.
Okay, now, back to the question of pollution. Say I have a well that I drink from on my property.
Yes.
And I get my scientist friend to come over and test it out, and he says it's all full of poisons and mercury and all sorts of stuff like that. Now, if there's no EPA to come in and regulate whoever's dumping that mercury, what can I do about it?
We restore civil law. In other words, we have what they used to have, which was common law courts or civil law courts, where you, because whoever was creating that pollution does not have the right to endanger your family or to destroy the health of you and your family. So you, if things were operating the way they should be, based on the fundamental principles our country was based upon, you would be able to go to court and immediately not only stop the person from continuing to damage you, but you would also be able to force them to compensate you. Now, if they were forced to compensate you and stop whatever they were doing, it would be very, very expensive for them to do that, and they would stop. The most effective way for us to end pollution in this country is to restore civil law. That is they'll be much more effective than trying to manage it from the top down. And
well, what if they're dumping mercury and it's ending up in my drinking water, and I go and try to sue them now when there is an EPA, and I don't believe in the EPA. I don't think they do a good job. I know that they're the whole special interest. So I go and file a lawsuit anyway, as it is right now. That won't work.
Here's the problem. If they've been able to effectively lobby to have a certain percentage of mercury in their runoff, you're screwed. There's nothing you can do.
Oh, so they just say, but Judge, we're within the regulations, and the judge says, sorry, pal, and that's the end of that?
Yeah. Now, here's where we picked up, Ed Noyes and I, who ran for Attorney General, and we wrote the book together. We started to pick up some very serious green support, environmental support for people. We have a big hog lot problem in this state. And runoff and smell and all the problems that go with these intensive hog lots. I think North Carolina and Iowa have more intensive hog lots than any other state in the country. And it's a terrible problem. It ends up destroying people's lives. You know, they end up, a hog lot moves in next to them, and their life is destroyed. They can't sleep at night, their kids get sick, and there's nothing they can do because the state has certain mandates that allow these people to operate within certain limitations. Well, let's say that the hog lot can't operate within 2 miles of your house, and you're exactly 2 miles and 1 foot on the other side of that line. There's nothing you can do. Your kids could be dying. You could be losing your teeth and losing your hair, and from all the smell and the stench and the water pollution and everything else, and literally be dying. There's nothing you could do. You can't go to court to sue that person because the state has mandated certain restrictions. And again, whether it's the state government or the federal government, it's from the top down. Whereas we really should have the courts taking care of these things. And if we did, there would not be these kind of problems in Iowa or North Carolina or any of these other states where you have hog lots. Because these hog lot operators wouldn't be able to operate if they were destroying the lives of the people downwind of them. They wouldn't be able to operate. They'd have to go somewhere where they weren't damaging other people or compensate those people. Some people might want to live there and take the money that these people would pay them. That would be up to them. You see what I'm saying?
Well, sure, but, here we are 200-something years after the Constitution was ratified, and
right.
I mean, one would argue that the reason that we've created this situation is because we needed to, that the old common law didn't take care of these things, and that's why we needed an EPA.
That's not why it happened. The reason it happened is because we forgot who had indigenous power, and we forgot what we were doing in terms of our power. We gave up our power to government. We began to believe that the government could solve our problems for us because it was easier than solving them ourselves, and we gradually gave up our rights under the Constitution. We gave up our indigenous power. And I believe the solution to all of our problems, whether it be world peace, whether it be cleaning up the environment, whether it be our economy, whether it be welfare and poverty, whether it be education, is taking back our indigenous power and starting to solve problems again at the level of the individual, the family, and the community, whether it be drugs. I mean, this is a really good classic example. It's drug war. It's the most absurd thing in the world, that here we are, supposedly intelligent human beings, thinking that the federal government can keep our children from doing drugs. We've given up our responsibility and our power to control our own family's drug use to the federal government. We're spending tens of billions, maybe by now hundreds of billions of dollars, giving up all of our rights, giving up all kinds of power to the police at every level over our lives to solve a problem that they could never, ever solve by declaring war on it. So, I mean, this is a classic example, and I'd do anything to keep a child, especially my own children, but any other child, from getting addicted to drugs. But the drug war has totally failed. Managing it from the federal level or the state level is a total failure. The only thing that works is community action, family, individual community action.
Well, and we now have a prison population comparable to Russia and China as the result of our drug war.
Actually, the numbers are that we have a higher percentage of people locked up than Russia ever did, even during the Gulag era, and more than China has now. And we have the gall to call China a police state, and failing in the human rights area when we have more people locked up who've never harmed another person. In my opinion, we should not be locking up people in behind bars unless they're a threat to another person. They've either threatened another person or they actually performed physical violence against another person. So that would eliminate about 70 or 80% of our prison population. It would make more room for the people who are violent, who are out on the street, because they let those people go to make room for drug people who've done drugs. And we would be safer, much safer, and we would be paying a significantly amount less for than we are right now in terms of the prisons. But the whole thing, you understand what's going on with the prison thing, right? I mean, we now have a prison industrial complex in this country. We have the prison guards who are unionized. We have the prison construction industry who's making a lot of money building prisons. All the people that work in the prisons, in addition to the guards, the maintenance people, are all unionized. So all those unions, all the unions that they're affiliated with, and they're affiliated with the major unions, are working to have laws that allow us to have more prisoners. So
sure. So if you're a politician and you try to end the drug war, all the lobbyists that come to you aren't going to necessarily be the moms of addicted kids. It's going to be the guy from the concrete and iron bar manufacturing company.
The moms with the addicted kids that want to get their kids out of prison because they're dying and they're being destroyed in these prisons. They have no political clout. Whereas the guard unions and the wardens and especially the prison construction industry has tremendous power with politicians. So it's a sick thing. Again, but it's we can change all this. I really believe that the whole thing is people becoming aware. One of the things that really, really rubs me wrong is the whole right-left, continuing this right-left dichotomy where people feel like they have to be on the right or the left. And what happens is we're being divided by that right-left program. And
well, you just feel free to go ahead and destroy that silly paradigm.
It is.
Go ahead.
Here's
I'm going to keep my mouth closed for 5 minutes as you tell them why they're all wrong.
Here's the paradigm. The paradigm is up versus down, not right versus left. You either believe in top-down command and control, force-based management of society, or you believe in individual freedom, liberty, and bottom-up based society. It's one or the other. So what we need to do is divide ourselves along that paradigm. How many people favor having all the power in the hands of a few people and those people making decisions for everybody else? And how many people favor having the individuals get back their indigenous power and have control over their own lives, their own families, and their own communities?
Well,
what do you think would win?
The unfortunate answer is that most people do want centralized power as long as they think that it's enforcing along the lines of their own ideas.
Well, it's up to you and me to let people know that paradigm is not working. Top-down, command and control, force-based management does not work. And it doesn't solve our problems. And we need to be responsible for ourselves, for our own families, for our own lives, and start to solve problems at our own level, in our own families, in our own communities, and take back our power from government at all levels. And we can do that. We just have to educate people, and we have to start at the local level. And I would really encourage people to get involved in the Libertarian Party, because the Libertarian Party is going to be your closest political party to being in tune with the principles that we're talking about here in terms of bottom-up government, and start to get involved. Get on your city council, get on your local school board, run for mayor, and start to make a difference. There are now 700 Libertarian office holders throughout the country. There's never been a third party with that many office holders. Most people don't know that. But the Libertarian Party is by far the largest third party in the country, and one of the largest we've ever had. And something's about to give. I think that a lot of Republicans who used to think, maybe some of them still do, I don't know how they could, that the Republican government was for smaller government, should now realize after the last 4 years that that no longer is the case. The Republican Party can no longer say that they're the party of smaller government. They've had the Senate, the House, and the presidency.
And the Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court. And they've grown government more than Bill Clinton did. And they're continuing to. They've spent more money on the Department of Education, which should have been abolished a long time ago. And there were Republicans, many Republicans, that weren't calling for that a few years ago. I think it was one of the things in the Contract for America. But anyway, it's clear now that the Republican Party is about one thing, and that's war. And it's security, and they're basing their whole campaign on the war on terrorism. And if you believe in freedom and you believe in liberty, you can't be a Republican anymore. I just don't see how you can. And I was a lifelong Republican, but that party left me a long time ago.
If they're running on the war on terrorism, maybe we should address the fact that the war on terrorism has been a disaster and that we've created far more enemies than we've gotten rid of. We're no more secure than we were before.
It's really amazing how many people you talk to who supposedly believe, conservatives, who supposedly believe in our Constitution, who have no understanding of what our fundamental philosophy of our country has been in terms of being entangled in other people's business in terms of other nations. It was very clearly laid out by our founders that we would have entangling alliances with no one. We'd have peaceful commerce with everyone. The idea that what I'm saying here is that we would withdraw from the world is nonsense. We would be fully engaged with everyone in the world in terms of commerce, in terms of business, in terms of importing and exporting, but we wouldn't be involved with them politically in their affairs. We wouldn't create alliances with one and enmities with another, because as soon as you become one country's friend, you become the enemy of that country's enemies. And our founders clearly understood this, because they'd spent a lot of time in France and in Holland and all over Europe trying to gain support for our for the Revolutionary War, and they knew that once we gained our freedom, that we had to stay miles away from those entangling alliances. And the idea that we're fighting for freedom in Iraq, to me, is completely absurd. It's all propaganda. What we've been told in the media about, that we're over there to create freedom for the people in Iraq, to me, is complete propaganda. People have to understand that we cannot go over there and create freedom for the people in Iraq. It's not going to happen. The longer we're there, the more the people are going to want to resist us. We need to get the heck out of there and let those people run their own lives, run their own country.
Well, then in that case, it sounds like the Republicans don't have a thing to run on. If all they have to run on is their foreign policy, and their foreign policy sucks and is a betrayal of what Jefferson would have had them do, then do they have anything to brag about at all?
No, not really. Not if you understand the fundamental principles our country was based on. They don't. But if you believe the propaganda, you believe that we were really in mortal danger of Iraq, but now that we're in mortal danger of Al-Qaeda, or we're in mortal danger of these countries, then you believe that we did it because of defense, that we had to defend ourselves, then you could justify support of those policies. But man, oh man, I don't know how anybody could believe that. It's all baloney. They've created this threat. The best thing that after 9/11 what the president should have done if he was a true leader, is he should have said to the people of our country, look, we have not been attacked by a foreign government. We have not been attacked by a foreign power. We've been attacked by some terrorists. We'll go out, we'll find who those terrorists are, and we will take care of them. But we are not going to go to war. We are not going to react in a way that is emotional. We are not going to start hurting innocent civilians. We're not going to do that. We're going to find the people who are responsible and take them out. But what did we do? We went to war. We went to war, declared war on several countries. First, Afghanistan, which we carpet bombed. I mean, how can you justify going after the people who are responsible for a terrorist act by carpet bombing an entire country? It's so absurd that intelligent people believe that was necessary, blows my mind.
Well, the Taliban, they were giving aid and comfort to Al-Qaeda.
So we go in and carpet bomb a whole country? Wouldn't it make a lot more sense to hire mercenaries to go in and find the people who really did it? Make sure we know who did it in the first place. I mean, it blows my mind. Another thing that blows my mind is that we have all these intelligence agencies. I think there's 72 intelligence agencies in our government that are supposed to protect us against these terrorist acts. None of them were able to protect us against us. And then within, I think it was about an hour and a half, they knew exactly who did it. I find that extremely hard to believe.
Well, so then the question is, did they really have no idea who did it or who was about to do it beforehand? Or were they just lying when they said they knew who did it after the fact? I
think a really complete, full investigation of the whole mess needs to be done, and not by their hand-picked people. So, it'll be very, very interesting to see what really happened with this whole thing. I know that there's been several FBI people who have come forward and said that they warned their superiors months before that this was going to happen. They had all kinds of evidence that it was going to happen, and nothing was done. You know what it reminds me of is back in about some few decades before Christ was born. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was when Julius Caesar was around, and Crassus, and I can't think of the other one. There was a triumvirate of the three of them. And it was when Spartacus had his slave revolt. And what they did was they knew that Spartacus wanted to get out of Italy. He had led his successful slave revolt. All the people wanted to do, the slaves and the gladiators who had fought with him wanted to get their families and get the heck out of Italy. So Spartacus had arranged for a group of ships to come, a captain of some merchants to come and get them and take them away. what happened was Crassus and Caesar and Pompey got together, and what they did was they sent one army to the north of where they were going to leave from, so they could not go north. They sent another army to the east, so they couldn't flee east. And they paid off the merchant, the ships, the captains, to not come and pick Spartacus up. So they had no way to escape. They only had one thing that they could do, and that was to march south on Rome. And so what they did was, Crassus did, is they went to the people of Rome, and Caesar, they went to the people of Rome and said, make us dictators, and we will save you. And that was the final end to the Roman Republic. So they knew exactly what was going to happen. It's almost as if what's happened here is the people who are in power knew this was going to happen, and they used this event to create the kind of power that they wanted to have so that they could do whatever they want, whether it was bomb Afghanistan, whether it was bomb Iraq, whatever the next step is. This war on terrorism has given them the license to do that, as well as take away many of our individual liberties in this country with the terrible Patriot Act. So, that's what it seems to me, and I think if you look back in history, you see that same kind of thing happening over and over again. People in power will use an event like this to gain more power. I think the whole thing was mishandled. If they weren't concerned about increasing their power, they wouldn't have reacted the way they did. Sure, they would have gone after Al-Qaeda or who was responsible for it, if they were really responsible for it, but they would not have declared war on half the world, and a war that never ends, which is exactly what you want if you're running a government, is a war that never ends.
And why is that? That's exactly
because that's the best way to maintain power. The best way to maintain power is to create fear and terror in the people, so that they will want you because they are afraid. They want security. They want to be protected. And if you create terror, you create fear, you constantly come up with different kinds of threats, the anthrax threat, and this threat, and that threat, and people are scared, then they'll vote for you. So that's why Bush will probably win, because they're so good at keeping people afraid.
Well, and this really goes to the heart of, I think, the number one argument against what you said. I mean, I have to say from my own point of view that I tend to agree with you. I think that is what happened, that the attack was allowed to proceed in order that they could gain, as you say, gain power from the reaction.
However, I don't think I'm not sure that's what happened,
right.
But it sure looks like it.
Right. And really, that's really my point, is that, I don't think all the evidence is really together yet to prove that that's the case, as it was during Pearl Harbor or the Lusitania or that kind of thing. However, I think that, for someone who just would never believe that for a second, the first thing they would say is, they would never do that. They would never do that. Why would they do that? You're crazy if you think that they would ever allow something like that to take place. Right. And that's why I really like your point about ancient Rome, is that, you can go all through history. Yes, they would do that.
Absolutely. Well, the thing is they really believe that they have to be in power to protect people. What happens is, Lincoln said it really beautifully. He said, if you really want to test a man's integrity, give him power, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Well, and we saw what he did with his absolute power, was kill a few 100,000 people.
So that's exactly what happened. I mean, once you gain power, you begin to think that you have to, that you begin to justify your actions, and you want to maintain your power, because power is very, very addicting. And that's what happens, and that's why, again, we need to go back. We need to remove a lot of the power of our federal and state government, in my opinion, and take that power away from them and bring it back to ourselves individually. And these things wouldn't be happening. But this is what's going to happen when we've allowed our federal government to be as big and powerful and rich as it is. And that really, I'll tell you, that probably our founders understood the importance of limiting the amount of money that the federal government could ever get. And the taxation that they put in, the method of taxation that they put into place, which was a portion tax only, was really one of the most brilliant things that they did. and said no direct taxes, and they only gave them the ability to tax in the case of emergency, and then that tax would have to be apportioned among each state. And it was used 4 or 5 times in history, and everybody hated it, but they paid it, and they were able to function efficiently within very, very limited constraints. Once we had an income tax and we had the Federal Reserve, where the politicians could basically go to the Federal Reserve and create out of thin air as much money as they wanted, that was the end of our freedom in this country. That was really, really the critical thing, the critical stage where we lost our freedom in this
Woodrow
country.
Wilson strikes again.
It was 1913 was the year of infamy for all those who love liberty.
And 4 years later, they had us in a war in Europe.
Yeah. Well, that was all part of the plan. I mean, they couldn't have had us in that war if they hadn't had the income tax and they hadn't had the Federal Reserve. They wouldn't have had the money to get us in that war. But
okay, now back on the issue of security here real quick. When you talk about
right.
bottom up,
right.
It makes perfect sense to me that individuals guaranteeing their own security is probably the best way to handle even a threat like international terrorism.
Well, that's why as soon as 9/11 happened, millions of people went out and bought firearms. Obviously the best homeland security, which I hate to even use that term, it just makes me sick. It sounds like something right out of Nazi Germany. But really the best way for us to protect ourselves against terrorism is for people to be able to protect themselves.
Yeah, no point in calling 911 when you already shot the guy and he's dead.
Well, my father was a judge and my father was a police officer in Chicago. So I grew up in a law enforcement family. And, all the law enforcement people that I ever met when I was growing up were clear on this. They all, totally understood that the only thing that they can do is they can react after a crime has been performed. They rarely are in a situation to stop a crime. Rarely. Almost never. Because, first of all, criminals are smart enough to execute their crime when there isn't a law enforcement officer around. I mean, obviously. And so what happens is that really people are ultimately responsible for their own defense. There's no way we could ever have enough police to defend ourselves at all times. So, I grew up in a family where, the Second Amendment and the ability of a person to protect themselves was an extremely important thing, and they were all law enforcement people. So, you're absolutely right again on that. It comes back to that's the ultimate example of bottom up. Law enforcement and self-defense should really be bottom up. People should be responsible for their own defense. They really ultimately are.
All right, Mr. Cleveland, last 10 minutes here. I want to give you a chance to appeal to the Green Party type left-wingers again. You did mention briefly education, healthcare, and welfare as things that the libertarian bottom-up founders of this country sort of model is the best way to handle that. And I think that those are probably the 3 issues: education, healthcare, and welfare, and the environment, of course, but we covered that. The left always claims a monopoly on those things, and always...
Well, you have to understand, first of all, that the government has failed to improve the situation in all 3 of those areas, and I would argue, and I believe that I could very well argue that they've made all 3 situations much, much worse. But let's take education first, because that is the clearest example. All you need to do is chart SAT scores in this country and chart those, and at the same time that the federal government started to get involved with education in this country, and see that as more money was spent at the federal level, SAT scores went down. And it's just such a clear relationship that I don't know how anybody could argue against it. The federal government has basically, with more and more top-down, mandated from the central level policies, really destroyed education, and the state governments too, I believe. But first of all, it's the money that goes to the federal government. Let's just talk about that. $60 billion. That was a couple of years ago. $60 billion. I don't know what it is now. It's probably up to $70 or $80 billion. Gary Bauer, who ran the Department of Education, said that these are his numbers and his statistics, and this is mind-blowing. 75% of the money that was collected by the federal government for the education budget stayed in Washington, D.C. 75%.
Wow.
So 25% of all your tax dollars, whether you're Green or Democrat or Republican or whatever, 75% of that money goes to bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. 25% comes back to your kid's school. That is reason enough right there to eliminate the Department of Education, because you would have a lot more money to spend on your local education if you weren't sending it to the federal government.
Is it right to ask government to be in charge of education on any level?
I don't think so.
I mean, it's still all based on coercion, correct?
Right, exactly. Here's a really fascinating statistic. In the 1830s, when Tocqueville came here to write Democracy in America, to research America, one of the things that completely blew his mind, and there were a lot of things, but one of the things that totally blew his mind was the level of the people that could read and write was unbelievable. It was like, I think it was, he said it was somewhere around 90 or 95% of Americans were literate. And this was in the 1830s. As opposed to France, for example, which had maybe a 5% literacy rate in 1830.
Well, that excludes the people who are owned by other people and forbidden from learning to read.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does, which is a whole other issue.
Right. I just want to make sure we're 95% of people who weren't slaves.
Right.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry. Please continue.
So our literacy rate among the non-slaves was higher than any country in the world at that time. We had a very, very much bottom-up educational system at that time. It was all local. It was all individual. It was family-based. It was community-based. And it worked. It was a phenomenal system. Our educational system has always, until the last 50 or 60 years, been based on the community. And people had the right to educate their kids the way that they wanted to within their communities. And gradually what's happened as state and federal government has gotten involved and it's become more top-down, the level of education that's actually going on in the schools has gotten worse. So we need to go back to a completely locally controlled educational system. And I think the more private it is and the less government is involved, the better it will be. And it's been proven. It's been proven by homeschooling. It's been proven by charter schools. If you give more power to people in the local community, education improves. Over and over again, this has been proven. So I would step one would be eliminate the Department of Education, have no federal involvement whatsoever, and for people within the states to allow the local communities to decide for themselves how they're going to educate their children within their communities. Give less money, give no money to the federal government, less money to the state government, and take care of it within your own community. Education will improve dramatically.
Right on. Okay, now healthcare. Shoot.
Okay, let me go to welfare first. Well, we still have some time. That's one. I think my mother was in the visiting nurses, so she was, in a related area, and my aunt and many of my relatives are social workers, and so this has been an area that we've been talking about in our family for debating one side versus another on what to do about welfare for many, many years. And again, it comes down to the same thing. What we've done is we've created a federal bureaucracy and a state bureaucracy. That bureaucracy has one thing that it really wants to do. It wants to maintain its power. And it's somewhere, the 75% figure of education is about the same. I think it's actually about 69 or 70% of the money that is spent by all the welfare organizations and divisions and departments in the federal government stays in Washington, D.C. Less than 30% actually goes to the people it's intended to help. Less than 30%. So again, if you eliminate that bureaucracy, you have a lot more money to deal with the problem. But that's not really the whole source of the finances as part of it. But what really it is is allowing people, and again, on the private associations, the private charities, that is where it's got to be done. Because the bureaucracy is never going to solve the poverty problem. It's never going to solve it. It really, what it does is it creates a system where people begin to get into this cycle of poverty, and they can never get out because the system keeps them in it, and it encourages it. They're clients. The people become clients of the people, and their livelihood depends, the people in that bureaucracy, their livelihood depends on people being in poverty.
Well, and know, people talk a lot about single motherhood in America and how a lot of that is the result of welfare, saying, oh, I'm sorry, you can't have any welfare unless you kick your man out of the house, and then, oh, here you go, here's your check. In fact, I know people who were told, like, oh, you're married, well, dump him and we'll hook you up big time. Mm-hmm. And I heard something not too long ago that, maybe a year or so ago, I was reading something that they were saying that in the 1930s during the Great Depression, that this is really how the extended family in America was destroyed and converted to the nuclear family.
That's exactly right.
It's okay if you have a husband in the house because single motherhood wasn't so in vogue back then. But you have to prove that you don't have any uncles or aunts or grandparents or anybody else that you can rely on. And so people were basically subsidized into breaking off their ties with their extended family. Mm-hmm. And now we're at the point where they've been subsidized to the point of even kicking the fathers out of the house. Mm-hmm.
Again, it all goes back to bottom up. And I think that most Greens, if they really read the core values, that's what they're talking about. The welfare problem, the poverty problem in this country can be much better solved on the community level, the family and the community level, than it can ever be solved through government. It's just an area that government shouldn't be involved in. It doesn't do well in that area. It doesn't do well in the education area. It doesn't do well in the healthcare area. The healthcare, it's the same thing. Do it on the local level. Don't try to do it for a mandated top-down management system. Right now, I can remember, I'm 54. I remember when I was a kid, my doctor came to our house. When I get a cold, he came to our house. We were a lower middle income family. My father was a railroad detective. And he could afford to have the doctor come to my house and take care of me. It's changed so much. The cost of health care is, I think, again, directly related to government involvement in the program, in the health care system. So, again, if we get government out, we will have a lot more. But people just have to take individual responsibility for their health. This idea, this concept that every person has a right to health care from the government, paid for by the government, is the most absurd thing I've ever heard of. There can be no right when it involves taking money, extracting money from another person against their will to pay for something for you. That's not a right. So it's something that, again, it just goes every one of these things goes back to indigenous power versus surrogate power. It goes back to individual responsibility versus giving your power to the government to take care of something for you that you need to be taking care of yourself or within your own family or your own community.
All right, everybody, you heard it. Clyde Cleveland. He's a former candidate for governor of Iowa. Hopefully will be running for president under the Libertarian Party nomination maybe next time.
Next time, not this time.
And the book is Restoring the Heart of America, A Return to Government by the People. Any closing comments, last word?
Yeah, we have a website, restoringtheheartofamerica.com, where you can order the book from that website. Again, that's restoringtheheartofamerica.com. And I also have my website is still up from when I ran for governor, and that's clevelandforgovernor.org. And I again would encourage people on the left that may be listening, and Greens and liberal Democrats, to take a look at my websites in more detail. Look at this whole concept of bottom-up government. It's all on my website, all these different issues. And definitely take a look at the genetic engineering issue. I think that's something that you need to see where I stand, and on the environmental issues and on the energy issue. and renewable energy. So those are areas that I know a lot about, and I think you'll like what you hear there. And I'd like to hear from people too. You know, my email address is on the website, and please feel free to contact me. And I hope people buy the book, and I'd like to hear from people who read the book.
Well, and I must say, it is a great book. I really enjoyed it. And hey, it's endorsed by Ron Paul and G. Edward Griffin. Who can argue with that?
Oh yeah, Ed Griffin is a very good friend of mine. Also, Gary Johnson, who was the governor of New Mexico, endorsed the book. I think he was a very good governor. Ron Paul, of course, is really a great hero of mine. I think he's phenomenal.
Well, I wish you could. Maybe you can come down to Austin next week. G. Edward Griffin's coming to give a speech, and I'm introducing him.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
Oh, well, tell everybody.
I'm going to have to write it 5 times.
Yeah, everybody should come and hear him. He is really a fantastic speaker. It's just so wonderful to hear him talk, and he's extremely knowledgeable. Ask him to talk about, he talks about what he calls the perfect tax, the tax that was put in place under our Constitution versus the tax system that we have now.
Cool.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for interviewing me, and good luck to all of your listeners and people. Please begin to realize that we have the power to solve the problems in this country. We have the ability to take back our power from the governments and the institutions that we've given our power to, and it's all about the indigenous power versus surrogate power. That's what it all comes to, and it's bottom up versus top down, not right versus left. We all have to start working together to take back our power.